was praying for some jewels, I was wishing for some swords, but it never came my way, so I had to count my losses. On a mission, level up and be a boss. I got stuck up in my ways. Little nigga, that ain't bullshit.
You mentioned Barack Obama in passing. Is it fair to say that he's really annoyed you from time to time, especially when he talks about black men not living up to their responsibility? I believe as a candidate back in 2008, he said that too many young black men act more like children than adults. Does that sort of rhetoric really piss you off?
Yeah, I didn't like that speech. You know, I have to say, I was a fanatic Obama supporter when he was running for office. You know, I was a fanatic Obama supporter, and, you know, in many ways, I feel like I drank the Kool-Aid, you know. And like so many, I think African Americans in particular really projected my deepest hopes and dreams on him, and imagined that he would be more than he is, or perhaps than he could be in his role as president. And so, yeah, I've been disappointed and somewhat disillusioned by some of the things that he has said and done. And the excerpt that you just kind of quoted from my book refers to a speech he gave on Father's Day while on the campaign trail. He's giving a speech on Father's Day in a black church while, you know, the media, of course, is there in full force, and, you know, uses Father's Day as an opportunity to chastise black men for acting like boys instead of men and being AWOL, while never acknowledging, of course, that right there in Chicago where he was speaking, there was a drug war raging, and that, you know, hundreds of thousands of black men have been taken from their families and their children, not voluntarily, but because they were rounded up in a drug war for committing these nonviolent, relatively minor drug offenses that go ignored on the other side of town. And
Thank you so much for having me here today. I just couldn't be any more thrilled. And thank you for that very generous introduction. I prefer to be underestimated. That was a little over the top, and but I appreciate so much the sentiment. And you know, I have been traveling from coast to coast for the last few years, trying to spread the message of my book to anyone who will listen, and after a while I became very tired. Said, I am not speaking anymore for a long time, and then this invitation came through, and I said, all right, I'm gonna get myself to the Fight Conference. I'm gonna be there, because the work that you all are doing is so critical, it's so important, and it is because of you that change is going to come. It is because of the tireless efforts of people like you, who often do not get the recognition, for whom there's often not much applause, that if truly transformational change arrives, it will be because of the tireless efforts of people like you. So I am so thrilled to be here, surrounded by so many open hearts, open minds, dedicated souls, committed to ending mass incarceration in America, and committed to recognizing the dignity and humanity of each and every one of us. I believe that mass incarceration is the most pressing social and racial justice issue of our time. And I know there are many people who will quibble with me and who would argue that there are many other crises and issues that ought to top the list. And I know there are many people here today that are working on many other important causes. and on behalf of many important peoples. But I feel confident pushing mass incarceration to the top of the list, to the forefront of our national consciousness, not only because our prison population quintupled in a 30-year period of time for reasons that have stunningly little to do with crime or crime rates, and not only because our nation has the highest rate of incarceration now in the world, making a mockery of our nation's claim to be the land of the free, but also because I believe to be true what numerous philosophers and theologians have long claimed, namely that any society, any civilization must be judged by how it treats its most vulnerable members and its prisoners. And in considering how we fare in that regard, I cannot help but think of the millions cycling in and out of our nation's prisons and jails. People like my friend Susan Burton, who cycled in and out of our nation's prisons and jails for 15 years in this post-civil rights, post-King era, a time when our prison population has quintupled and millions of people, overwhelmingly poor people and people of color, are now locked up, locked out, and stripped of the very civil and human rights that Dr. King and so many others risked their lives for, and some even died for. I think of Susan, whose son was killed by the police. A police officer barreling down her street in Los Angeles ran over her 5-year-old boy. And she received no apology, no acknowledgement of her loss. She fell into a deep, deep depression, unspeakable grief, ultimately becoming addicted to crack cocaine. Now, if Susan had been wealthy, in fact, if she had just been solidly middle class with a good job and a good health care plan, no doubt she would have qualified for many, many hours of therapy. She would have been prescribed good legal drugs that would have helped her cope with her depression and grief. But things were different for Susan. Impoverished, living in South LA, she turned to the streets and became addicted to crack cocaine, and thus began her odyssey for 15 years, cycling in and out of prison. Every time she was pushed out onto the streets without any drug treatment, no job, forced to check the box on employment applications, denied access to housing. For 15 years, cycling in and out of prison until finally, by the grace of God, she got access to a private drug treatment facility and was given a job. And when she became clean and was able to get her own home, she decided she was going to devote the rest of her life to ensuring that no other woman would ever have to go through what she went through. And she began just by going down to Skid Row in Los Angeles, meeting women as they were getting off the prison bus with nothing but a cardboard box carrying their belongings. And she would meet these women coming off the bus, women who were strangers to them, and she would say, "Come home with me. You can sleep on my couch. You can sleep on the floor in my dining room. You just come home with me. You don't have to turn to the streets tonight." Susan now runs 5 safe homes for women in Los Angeles called A New Way of Life. And beyond that, she is helping to build a movement. She's helping to organize and train formerly incarcerated people to be bold, inspired advocates for the restoration of their basic civil and human rights, working together with All of Us or None and the formerly incarcerated and convicted people's movement. They are doing more than just helping folks one by one, but are organizing, speaking up, speaking out collectively. Clearly now, Susan and so many others are now doing the hard work of saving the soul of American democracy. And so are many of you here today doing precisely that work, planting the seeds of revolution. The revolution of values that Martin Luther King Jr. and so many others prayed for and marched for and risked their lives for. And as I've traveled and spoken in cities and towns, spoken inside prisons and reentry centers, spoken at universities and churches, I've begun to see that these seeds have begun to grow and sprout in all kinds of places, like grass pushing up through a little crack in the sidewalk, reaching for sun and bursting through the concrete against all odds. An upheaval has begun. People of all colors are beginning to raise their voices a little louder. People who've spent time behind bars are organizing for justice. Young people are becoming bolder and more defiant and challenging the prison industrial complex. And people of faith are finally waking up to the uncomfortable reality that we have been complicit in the birth and maintenance of a system predicated on denying to God's children the very forms of compassion, forgiveness, and possibilities for redemption that we claim to cherish. Even in the halls of power, winds of change have begun to blow. I turn on the evening news and I see the Attorney General of the United States condemning felon disenfranchisement laws and harsh mandatory minimum sentences. For the first time in decades, it appears that the prison building boom is slowing down. The numbers of people in cages beginning to decline. State legislatures are reforming drug laws aimed at nonviolent drug offenders, and marijuana legalization has taken hold in Colorado and Washington. Change seems to be in the air. And it all looks so good when I'm sitting on my couch with a remote control on one hand, flipping through the channels. How tempting it is to imagine that this problem is just sorting itself out on its own. How convenient it would be if the emerging bipartisan consensus that our nation ought to get smart on crime means that truly transformational change is on its way. But whenever my thoughts drift dangerously towards complacency, I hear that voice whispering to me, a voice that returns whenever I get tired or lazy and begin to think that maybe someone else will do my work, make my contribution for me. That inner voice repeats the words of Dr. King. Human progress never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts and the persistent work of dedicated individuals who are willing to be co-workers with God. And without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the primitive forces of social stagnation. Social stagnation, I think that is precisely the danger we face now. A little reform here, a little reform there, and then nothing. A new normal that looks and feels much like the old. The sleeping giant may toss and turn and then ultimately choose to stay in bed, imagining that someone else will do the work that is ours to do. Many of us, some of us, have a comfortable bed and simply don't want to be disturbed. Now, I remember my early stirrings. Although I was a civil rights lawyer and firmly committed to social justice, it took me a long while to see the bigger picture. Only after years of representing victims of racial profiling and investigating patterns of drug law enforcement and attempting to assist people released from prison re-enter, only to be faced with one legal barrier after another to mere survival, did I finally wake up to the reality that social justice advocates like me were not wrestling with mere social or legal problems. We were dealing with a vast new system of racial and social control, the rise of a new caste-like system in America, one that shuttles our children from decrepit, underfunded schools to brand new high-tech prisons. It is. It is a system that locks poor people, overwhelmingly poor people of color, into a permanent second-class status nearly as effectively as earlier systems of racial and social control once did. It is, in my view, the moral equivalent of Jim Crow. Now, this system cannot be reformed and thereby redeemed any more than it would have been possible to reform slavery or Jim Crow and thereby approach justice. The system of mass incarceration is rotten to its core. It is. As I write in the introduction to my book, what has changed since the collapse of Jim Crow has less to do with the basic structure of our society than the language we use to justify it. In the era of color blindness, it is no longer socially permissible to use race explicitly as a justification for discrimination, exclusion, and social contempt. So we don't. Rather than rely on race, we use our criminal justice system to label people of color criminals and then engage in all the practices we supposedly left behind. Today, it is perfectly legal to discriminate against criminals in nearly all the ways in which it was once legal to discriminate against African Americans. Once you're labeled a felon, the old forms of discrimination, employment discrimination, housing discrimination, denial of the right to vote, exclusion from jury service, suddenly legal. As a criminal, you have scarcely more rights and arguably less respect than a black man living in Alabama at the height of Jim Crow. We have not ended racial caste in America, we have merely redesigned it. Now, I know that many people in this room may be very familiar with the crisis at hand and already know the facts. But if you don't know, you need to know. More African American adults are under correctional control today, in prison or jail, on probation or parole, than were enslaved in 1850, a decade before the Civil War, than in 1870, the year the 15th Amendment was ratified, prohibiting laws that explicitly deny the right to vote on the basis of race. Now, of course, during the Jim Crow era, poll taxes and literacy tests operated to keep black folks from the polls. Well, today, felon disenfranchisement laws accomplish in many states what poll taxes and literacy tests ultimately could not. 80% of all African American children can now expect to spend a significant part of their childhood years living apart from their fathers. And contrary to the image presented in the media of black men being a bunch of deadbeat dads who don't care enough about their children to be involved, the research actually shows that black men who are separated from their children due to imprisonment, divorce, or any other factor are actually more likely to attempt to maintain regular contact with their children than fathers of any other racial or ethnic group. Black fathers do care about their children as much as other fathers. They do. But black men, more than any other racial or ethnic group, face extraordinary challenges playing the role of traditional father today. So many of them have been branded criminals and branded felons, finding themselves unable to work, barred from housing, deemed ineligible for basic public benefits. They find themselves struggling to provide food just for themselves, much less their families, shelter, or basic financial support. Now, that's not to say that black men couldn't do a better job of being fathers. They could. But so could white men, so could Asian men, so could Latino men. And we as mothers could do a better job of being parents to our own children. But the reality is that in this era of mass incarceration, we have found it convenient to demonize certain groups and imagine that there is something intrinsically wrong with some people, and then justify disposing of them en masse. Now, this phenomenon does not affect just some small segment of the African American community. To the contrary, in many large urban areas today, more than half of working age African American men now have criminal records and are thus subject to legalized discrimination for the rest of their lives. In cities like Chicago, I'm not sure about the exact stats here in Philadelphia, but in cities like Chicago, nearly 80% of working age African American men now have criminal records and are thus subject to legalized discrimination for the rest of their lives. These men are part of a growing undercaste, not class, a group of people defined largely by race, relegated to a permanent second-class status by law. Now, when I tell people that I believe that our criminal justice system now functions much more like a caste system than a system of crime prevention or control, people say, "What are you talking about? You lost your mind? Our criminal justice system isn't a system of racial control, it's a system of crime control. And if black people would just stop committing so many crimes, they wouldn't have to worry about being locked up and then stripped of their basic civil and human rights." But therein lies the greatest myth about mass incarceration, namely that it's been driven by crime or crime rates. It's not true. It's just not true. Our prison population quintupled in 30 years. We went from a prison population of about 350,000 to well over 2 million for reasons that have little to do with crime or crime rates. Crime rates have fluctuated in that 30-year period of time and are currently at historical lows, but incarceration rates consistently soared. Most criminologists and sociologists today will acknowledge that crime rates and incarceration rates in the United States have moved independently of one another. Incarceration rates have soared, especially black incarceration rates have soared, regardless of whether crime is going up or going down in any given community or the nation as a whole. So what explains the sudden explosion in incarceration rates, the birth of a penal system unprecedented in world history, not simply crime and crime rates? Well, the answer is the war on drugs and the Get Tough movement, the wave of punitiveness that washed over the United States. What's changed dramatically was not so much just crime, but what we count as crime and how we respond to the people we imagine are committing it. And nothing has contributed more to the emergence of this caste system than the war on drugs. Now, I am very tempted right now to give you an overview of the drug war and how it actually works as opposed to how it's advertised, and how it's decimated communities of color and growing numbers of white communities as well, and how our legal system has conspired to keep millions of people cycling in and out of the system for the rest of their lives. And I know that many of you in the audience may think you already know how the system works, like I did while I was working as a civil rights lawyer, but you may not. You may think you have some idea of what's going on, how the system is rigged, but you may not know the half of it. But in the short time I have here today, I want to focus on some solutions, what we are going to do, not take all my time to describe the problem. But don't get me wrong, understanding the problem, really understanding it, how we got to this place in our history is critically important. For if we don't know our history, we are doomed to repeat it. So if you don't know the role the drug war has played in quintupling our prison population, if you don't know that whites are just as likely as people of color to use and sell illegal drugs, if you don't know that 90% of all drug offenders sent to prison in some states have been one race, African American, or if you don't know about the financial incentives that have been granted to law enforcement, millions of dollars paid to local law enforcement agencies for the sheer numbers of people swept in for minor drug offenses, if you don't know about federal drug forfeiture laws and those financial incentives that are given to law enforcement, about the direct monetary interest that law enforcement has had, not in ending drug addiction or drug abuse or even drug-related crime, but in the longevity of this war itself. Or if you're confused and think that maybe the drug war has been focused on rooting out violent offenders or drug kingpins, and if you don't know that the overwhelming majority of people swept into the system have been arrested for nonviolent or relatively minor drug offenses, the very sorts of crimes that occur with roughly equal frequency in middle-class white communities and on college campuses but go largely ignored. And if you don't know that the system operates practically from cradle to grave, targeting young people at very young ages, stopping, frisking, searching them, often before they're old enough to drive a car, when all they may be doing is walking down the sidewalk with nothing but a can of iced tea and some Skittles in their pocket. You don't know. If you don't know, then you need to know. You don't know that the entire system of mass incarceration can be traced back in large part to segregationists who once chanted segregation forever and then changed their tune in 1964 and began chanting law and order and building a Get Tough movement, a movement designed by pollsters and political strategists who found that thinly veiled promises to get tough on them, a group not so subtly defined by race, could be enormously successful in persuading poor and working class whites to defect from the Democratic New Deal coalition and join the Republican Party in droves. You don't know about the Southern strategy, which used welfare and crime as racial code language as a means to break the Democratic Party in the South and build a new Republican majority and ultimately a prison system unprecedented in world history. Then read my book. If you're operating under some delusion that Democrats have been the better angels, that they've been kinder or gentler in the era of mass incarceration, if you don't know that it was President Bill Clinton who mastered the game of using subtle racial appeals, and that it was his administration, a Democratic administration, that escalated the drug war far beyond what his Republican predecessors dreamed possible, if you don't know the role the U.S. Supreme Court has played in engineering the system of mass incarceration, eviscerating Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable searches and seizures, closing the courthouse doors to claims of racial bias at every stage of the criminal justice process, from stops and searches to plea bargaining and sentencing. If you don't know this history, if you cannot connect the dots between slavery, Jim Crow, and mass incarceration today, then please read the book, but don't start with mine or finish with mine. Read Angela Davis's book. Are Prisons Obsolete? And read Ruthie Gilmore's book, Golden Gulag, and Douglas Blackman's book, Slavery by Another Name, and Paul Butler's book, Let's Get Free, A Hip-Hop Theory of Justice, Christian Parenti's book, Lockdown America. Read Prison Profiteers, Who Makes Money Off of Mass Incarceration. I could go on and on listing the incredible resources that are available today and talking about the problem, but what I really want to do is spend a few minutes right now to challenge us. What are we willing to do? What are we willing to do to end the system and collectively create something new? For I believe the ultimate question we're faced is whether we're willing to truly rise to the challenge this moment in our history presents. Are we willing to do the work to end the drug war in its entirety, not simply downsize it a bit? Are we willing to abolish legal discrimination against people with criminal records, discrimination that denies them basic human rights to work, to shelter, to education, to food? Are we willing to organize, really organize for restorative justice, rehabilitative models, and transformative models of justice that take seriously the interests of the victim, the offender, and the community as a whole? Are we willing to tell the truth, the whole truth, about the values and ideologies that brought us to this place? Or are we at risk of going back to sleep and tolerating a slightly downsized version of the prison industrial complex, one that still cages and perpetually controls millions, but on a slightly smaller scale? These are the questions for our time, because it's going to require great courage and some real sacrifice for us to stand up for, to stand with those who are viewed as the least of these. The criminals, the felons, the despised, those labeled illegal, and to insist publicly on their humanity, their dignity, their value, in society and in the eyes of God. It will not be easy for the public to learn to care for the drug addict as well as the drug dealer, or to see that the victim of a horrible crime as well as the perpetrator are both children of God and worthy of our profound care and concern. People may be reluctant to see that the woman who crossed the border illegally in the hope of a better life deserves our sincere compassion, as does the young man who sold some weed to help his mama pay the rent. People are going to need some help learning to feel compassion for the man released from prison with HIV, who then infects the mother of his child. People are going to need some help. We're going to need some help. Ultimately, we are going to have to awaken within ourselves and our nation as a whole a shift in consciousness, a birth of a movement unlike this nation has ever seen, one that is rooted in the awareness of the fundamental dignity and basic humanity of each and every one of us, no matter who we are, where we came from, or what we've done. Nothing less will do. And I know that surely many people will say, oh, much less will do. Just look at all the progress that's being made in the halls of power today. Sadly, though, so much of that progress is illusory. Most of the reform at the state level has been driven by a growing awareness of the fiscal crisis, not a growing awareness of the humanity of those locked in cages. So much of the momentum behind prison reform today is all about saving dollars and cents, not about saving lives, saving futures, saving communities. Politicians across the political spectrum, including former Get Tough true believers like Newt Gingrich, are now calling for modest reforms because they know it is impossible to maintain the vast new penal state without raising taxes on the predominantly white middle class. And yes, some progress can be made without building a truly transformative movement. We may succeed, we may manage to persuade mainstream voters that our prisons are just too expensive, or that drug use should be viewed more as a public health problem than a crime, without ever challenging people and ourselves to care, really care more for those who are viewed as the others. We can win by saying whatever the pollsters tell us will work, and we can appeal to people's self-interest and fiscal concerns. But if we choose that path, we cannot pretend we are traveling a road that will lead to higher ground. What we face is a profound moral and spiritual crisis, not merely a social, political, or economic one. In the end, if our advocacy fails to build a new moral consensus, if it fails to cultivate an ethic of genuine care, compassion, and concern for every human being of every race, class, nationality, the reforms we achieve will not bring an end to caste-like systems in America. Mass incarceration, as well as mass deportation, will remain, just downsized a bit, or a new system of racial and social control will emerge, one that we cannot foresee, just as the current system of mass incarceration was utterly unimaginable just 40 years ago. The evil of these systems lie not in their cost, not in their inefficiency or impracticality. The evil lies in the belief that some of us are disposable, some of us are unworthy of concern. And until we challenge that core belief, systems of racial and social control will continue to thrive in this country and be born again and again for a long, long time. Far more is required of us. We are going to have to ask ourselves some difficult questions. It's easy to point the finger at politicians, but what about our own attitudes about crime and criminals? Whose stories are we willing to listen to? Whose causes are we willing to champion? Who do we believe or disbelieve? Who do we consider the others? Who are we willing to embrace as one of us? who do we really care about? These are the questions that we must ask not only politicians, but ourselves as we get to work building this movement. And I firmly believe that nothing short of a major movement will do. And if you doubt this, all you need to do is check out the sheer scale of the system that has been built. If we were to return to the rates of incarceration that we had in the 1970s, before the war on drugs and the Get Tough movement truly kicked off, we would have to release 4 out of 5 people who are in prison today. More than 1 million people who are now employed by our criminal justice system would need to find a new line of work. Most new prison construction has occurred in predominantly white rural communities, communities that are often very vulnerable economically, communities that have been persuaded that prisons are the answer to their economic woes, and very often they've been sold a bill of goods because prisons often do not deliver the kind of economic benefits that are advertised, but nonetheless, these communities across America have come to believe that their jobs, their welfare depends on prisons, but these prisons across America would have to close down. Private prison companies now listed on the New York Stock Exchange and doing quite well even in a time of economic recession, they would have to file for bankruptcy. This system is now so deeply rooted in our social, political, and economic structure, it's not going to just fade away. It's not going to just downsize out of sight without an enormous upheaval, a fairly radical shift in our public consciousness. We as a nation are going to have to reckon with the reality that this entire system of mass incarceration would not even exist today, but for the fact that at the outset of the Get Tough movement and the war on drugs, the enemy was defined as black and brown. And it is that fact that opened the gates to a flood of punitiveness that has now destroyed the lives and communities of people of all colors. Any attempt to just move on by focusing on what's smart on crime or what works without acknowledging this racial dimension, without discussing the necessity of reparations, and by that I mean a commitment to repairing the harm that has been done, will lead to future cycles of racial and social control. Often people will say to me, oh yes, the problem is enormous, but it's a mistake to talk about race or even class issues right now. It just makes people angry. It just polarizes the debate. We can't seriously build a racial justice movement around criminals. They say we have to just learn to play politics smart. This is about dollars and cents. We must be strategic and play that political game. We could talk about movement building later. Let's just squeeze what we can out of the current political moment and see how far we can get. Well, this kind of pragmatic fiscal talk and colorblind approach is understandable, but it leads to a dead end. What we face in this nation is a profound moral crisis, a crisis of the magnitude that we faced during Jim Crow. It's not just a budget or an overcrowding crisis. If we fail to get this, really get this, we may find ourselves worse off 10 years from now than where we are today. My greatest fear is that we'll continue to see some modest downsizing of our prison system in the months and years to come, but then we'll reach a new plateau. We'll reach a level of imprisonment that is still unconscionable, higher than other Western democracies, but reformers will pat themselves on the back and congratulate themselves on a job well done. They'll say, well, we did what we could within current political constraints, and then they'll move on to some other issue to provide a moment of opportunity somewhere else, and the caste-like system will remain perfectly intact. Millions of people, primarily poor folks of color, will continue cycling in and out of our criminal justice system. Millions of young black and brown boys will still be branded criminals at young ages. Millions still stripped of voting rights, denied the right to jury service, denied access to employment. The amount of time people spend behind bars may be shorter. Instead of spending 10 years in prison, they might spend 6. Or instead of 5 years in prison, they might spend 2. Or instead of 2, they might get just felony probation. No prison time, but still a felon for life. Trapped in an undercast and likely to return to prison in less than 3 years. The new Jim Crow will still be alive and well, just modified. It is possible to shrink our prison system quite dramatically without changing the nature of this caste system. If we reduce the length of prison sentences by half, we can cut the size of the prison population by half. But if we do not change the caste-like system that exists in our communities, we will still have millions cycling in and out of prison, just spending less time when they come through. Today, there are 2 million in prison, but more than 7 million under correctional control. And more than 60 million people in the United States now have criminal records. Reducing the prison population is only one of the many important steps towards dismantling this caste-like system in America. Changing the mindset that birthed this system is what it's all about. Building a human rights movement that guarantees basic human rights for every person of every class and every race, the right to quality education, the right to housing, the right to food, the right to work. These basic human rights must be honored if we are ever to abolish this caste system known as mass incarceration. As long as poor people of color are viewed as largely disposable, with the only limiting principle being how much it costs to throw them away, caste-like systems will be a recurring, if not permanent, feature of American life. Already we've seen how laws have allowed private prison companies to expand into a whole new market, immigration. Private prison companies have found a whole new market. As the drug war has slowed down in some states, they have found they can adapt and morph and continue to grow by caging another group of people. Although colorblind cost-benefit approaches often seem pragmatic in the short run, in the long run, they leave intact the racial anxieties, stereotypes, and attitudes that gave rise to the system in the first place. The problem lies in the nature of the system itself, not the cost. And the only way to dismantle this system is by building a broad coalition, a united front, unwilling to accept this system at any price. So what do we do? Well, I believe it begins by mustering the willingness within each and every one of us to tell the truth, the whole truth, about how we got here, how we managed to birth this prison system, unlike anything the world has ever seen. And we have got to create spaces for formerly incarcerated people and their families and people who are behind bars to raise their own voices. For too long, it has been the experts and people like me speaking on behalf of and for people who have experienced the system itself and know best the harm it causes. Our country will never come to care about those labeled criminals until they come to know them and meet them. And so it is high time we begin to hear from them and support the leadership and advocacy of formerly incarcerated people and their organizations. Build an underground railroad for people released from prison, an underground railroad for people trying to make a break for true freedom, providing support, health care, HIV treatment and support, help finding jobs, employment, housing, food, helping people reconnect with their families, helping to ensure that folks released from prison in this era of mass incarceration have some chance not just of surviving, but thriving and joining this movement that is emerging. But of course, just trying to shuttle a few to freedom one by one isn't going to be enough. Just as in the days of slavery, it wasn't enough to build an underground railroad. You also had to be willing to work for abolition. Well, today I believe we have got to be willing to work for the abolition of the system of mass incarceration as a whole. And that means ending the war on drugs once and for all. It means abolishing all forms of legal discrimination against people released from prison. It means adopting more restorative and rehabilitative and transformative approaches to justice that take seriously the interests of the victim, the offender, and the community as a whole. We have got a lot of work to do. And if it seems like too much, if it seems like it can't possibly all be done, keep in mind that all of these rules, laws, policies, and practices that comprise this system of mass incarceration, they all rest upon one core belief, And it is the same core belief that sustained Jim Crow. It is the belief that some of us are not worthy of genuine care, compassion, or concern. And when we effectively challenge that core belief, this whole system begins to fall like dominoes. Yes. A multiracial, multi-ethnic human rights movement must be born, one that takes seriously the dignity and humanity of all people. But before this movement can truly get underway, a great awakening is required. We've got to awaken from this colorblind slumber we've been in to the realities of race in America. And we have got to be willing to embrace those labeled criminals. Not necessarily all their behavior, but them, their humanness. For it has been the refusal and failure to recognize the dignity and humanity of all people that has been the sturdy foundation of every caste system that has ever existed in the United States or anywhere else in the world. It's our task, I firmly believe, to end not just mass incarceration, not just the war on drugs, but to end this history and cycle of creating caste-like systems in America. Thank you so much for having me and all the great work that you do.
Hit that subscribe button, bro. Hit that subscribe button. Hit them buttons. Hit all the bells. Hit all the bells, B.